The jungle was quiet for a moment that did not feel natural. The air hung thick and wet, the kind of heat that clings to your skin even before the sun rises. It was early morning, July 21st, 1944, somewhere near the village of Aslito on the island of Saipan. American Marines had been fighting for weeks across this volcanic island in the Mariana Chain. They had faced artillery, snipers, caves filled with hidden machine guns. But now, something different was moving in the darkness ahead. From the distant tree line came the low grinding sound of engines. At first it was faint, just a distant rumble beneath the insects and wind. But the Marines lying in shallow foxholes knew exactly what it meant. Tanks, Japanese armor. A young Marine private tightened his grip around a strange new weapon resting beside him. It looked nothing like the rifles he trained with back in California. It was long and hollow like a metal pipe. At the back was a simple battery trigger system. The warhead was large and blunt. The Americans had given it a simple nickname, the Bazooka. The Marines waited as the sound of engines grew louder. The ground began to vibrate. Somewhere in the darkness, Japanese tank commanders believed they were about to crush the American lines, but what they did not know was that the battlefield had just changed, and the weapon waiting for them could punch straight through the steel armor of their Type 97 tanks. To understand why this moment mattered, we have to go back a few years earlier, before the jungles of Saipan, before the Pacific War turned brutal and desperate. In the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army believed their tanks were good enough for the wars they expected to fight. Their main medium tank was the Type 97 Chiha. It entered service in 1937 and quickly became the backbone of Japanese armored units. The tank was not designed to fight powerful enemy armor. Japan expected its tanks to support infantry attacks, break through defensive positions, and fight lightly equipped enemies in places like China and Southeast Asia. The Type 97 weighed around 15 tons. It had a crew of 4 men. The armor was thin by European standards, usually between 8 and 25 millimeters thick. The main gun was a 57-millimeter low-velocity cannon designed mostly for infantry support rather than tank battles. Early in the war, this design worked well enough. In China, Japanese tanks rarely faced enemy armor. But during the invasions of Malaya and the Philippines in 1941 and early 1942, Allied forces had very few tanks and almost no effective anti-tank weapons. Japanese armored units moved quickly down jungle roads and plantation paths, often surprising defenders who believed tanks could not move through such terrain. In those early months, the Type 97 looked unstoppable, but the war was changing faster than anyone expected. Across the Pacific, American engineers were already working on new weapons to deal with armored vehicles. One of the most unusual projects started in 1942, when the U.S. Army began experimenting with rocket-powered anti-tank weapons. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of firing a solid shell using gunpowder, the weapon would launch a rocket with a shaped charge warhead. When it hit armor, the explosive would focus its energy into a narrow jet capable of burning through steel. This technology was called a heat round, high-explosive anti-tank. The first practical version became the M1 rocket launcher, but soldiers gave it a nickname that stuck, the Bazooka. The name came from a strange musical instrument used by American comedian Bob Burns. The long metal launcher looked similar to the instrument, and the name quickly spread among troops. Early versions of the Bazooka had problems. The M1 and M1A1 models had electrical firing issues, fragile rockets, and limited reliability in wet conditions. But the concept worked. Tests showed the rocket could penetrate over 70 millimeters of armor. That was more than enough to destroy the thin armor of Japanese tanks. By 1943, Improved versions like the M9 Bazooka were entering combat units. The weapon was light enough to be carried by 2 soldiers. One carried the launcher, while the other carried extra rockets. It could be fired from the shoulder, allowing infantry to hunt tanks in places where artillery or larger guns could not reach. Dense jungles, urban ruins, island battlefields, places exactly like the Pacific War. Meanwhile, Japanese tank commanders still believed their armor would face mostly rifles and machine guns. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy and difficult to move in jungle terrain. Rocket launchers were not something they expected. That misunderstanding would become deadly. But even before the bazooka arrived in the Pacific in large numbers, American soldiers had already tested the weapon in other theaters. In North Africa during 1942 and 1943, U.S. troops used early bazookas against German and Italian tanks. The weapon was not perfect, but it proved that a portable rocket launcher could threaten armored vehicles. Military observers carefully studied these early battles. Reports sent back to Washington described both the strengths and weaknesses of the new weapon. Engineers improved the rocket design, strengthened the launcher, and improved the ignition system. By the time the war intensified across the Pacific Islands, the bazooka was more reliable, and American troops were learning exactly how to use it. By mid-1944, the United States had begun one of the most important campaigns of the Pacific War, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Saipan was the key. On June 15, 1944, the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance launched the amphibious assault. More than 70,000 Marines and Army soldiers would eventually land on the island. Defending Saipan was the Japanese 43rd Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. Among the defenders were several tank units equipped with Type 97 Chiha and the newer Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha tanks. These tanks had slightly better firepower with a high-velocity 47mm gun, but their armor was still thin. As American forces pushed inland from the beaches, the Japanese prepared counterattacks. The most famous of these came during the night of June 16th to June 17th. Japanese tank commanders believed a strong armored charge in darkness could break the American beachhead before heavy weapons were fully established. Around midnight, more than 40 Japanese tanks began moving toward Marine positions near Charan Kanoa. Inside the steel hulls of the Type 97s, crews prepared for battle. Tank engines roared in the tropical night. Tracks crushed coral roads and vegetation. Tank commanders scanned the darkness through narrow vision ports. Many of them believed American infantry would run when they saw the tanks coming. Instead, the Marines waited. In the defensive lines, bazooka teams moved forward quietly. They crawled into shell holes and behind broken palm trunks. The bazooka was not a long-range weapon. The best shots came within about 30 to 100 meters. That meant the Marines had to let the tanks come close. Very close. Some Marines later described how they could smell the engine exhaust from the approaching tanks. The sound of metal tracks scraping coral became louder with every second. You can almost feel the tension in those foxholes as men waited for the right moment. As the Japanese column rolled forward, the first tank appeared through the trees. One Marine later described the moment as terrifying. The tank looked enormous in the darkness, its engine loud enough to feel through the ground. But when it came within range, the bazooka gunner took aim. The rocket fired with a flash and a burst of smoke. The shaped charge slammed into the side armor of the Type 97. A fraction of a second later, the warhead detonated. The focused jet of molten metal punched straight through the tank's armor plate. Inside the tank, the results were devastating. The blast filled the crew compartment with fragments of metal and superheated gas. Ammunition sometimes ignited instantly. The tank stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. More rockets followed, one after another. Bazooka teams targeted the sides and rear of the Japanese tanks, where armor was weakest. Some Marines waited until tanks rolled past their positions before firing into the engine compartments. The Japanese crews had almost no warning. Many had never seen this weapon before. From inside their tanks, it must have felt like invisible explosions were suddenly ripping through the armor that was supposed to protect them. Within minutes, several tanks were burning. The battlefield became chaotic. Japanese tank commanders tried to maneuver, but the terrain worked against them. Coconut trees, trenches, and craters limited movement, and every time a tank slowed down or turned, another bazooka rocket found its mark. Marine riflemen joined the fight as well, throwing grenades and firing at exposed tank crews who tried to escape. Machine gunners opened fire on Japanese infantry following the tanks. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness as the battlefield filled with smoke and shouting. By dawn, the Japanese armored attack had collapsed. More than 24 tanks had been destroyed or disabled. The bazooka had proven itself. But this was only one battle in a long campaign where the weapon would change the way infantry fought armored vehicles. As the war moved across the Pacific Islands, American soldiers and Marines grew more skilled with the bazooka. Training emphasized teamwork. A typical bazooka team consisted of a gunner and an assistant. The assistant carried extra rockets, helped reload the launcher, and watched for enemy infantry that might try to kill the gunner. In jungle fighting, bazooka teams often worked alongside rifle squads. The launcher was used not only against tanks, but also against bunkers, pillboxes, and cave entrances. The rocket's explosive power could collapse defensive positions that would otherwise require artillery. Meanwhile, Japanese armored doctrine struggled to adapt. Japanese tank units were trained primarily for infantry support rather than independent armored warfare. They often attacked without strong coordination with artillery or air support. In the open plains of Europe, tanks could maneuver and fight at long range. But in the Pacific, battlefields were crowded with jungle, hills, and narrow trails. This environment made tanks vulnerable. American troops learned to ambush them. The bazooka became the perfect weapon for this kind of fighting. During the Battle of Guam in July 1944, similar scenes played out again. Japanese tank units attempted nighttime counterattacks against American lines. Bazooka teams waited in silence. When the tanks appeared, rockets streaked through the darkness. Another wave of Type 97s burned. One Marine veteran later recalled the strange mix of fear and confidence that came with carrying the weapon. The bazooka could destroy a tank, but the gunner had to stay calm long enough to aim carefully. The rocket launcher produced a bright flash and loud backblast. That meant the gunner's position was immediately revealed. Japanese infantry often tried to hunt bazooka teams as soon as they fired. Many gunners were wounded or killed seconds after launching their rockets. Yet the weapon remained one of the most feared tools on the battlefield. For Japanese tank crews, the psychological effect was enormous. Early in the war, tanks had been symbols of power and protection. Infantry often felt safer moving behind them. But once bazookas appeared, that sense of safety vanished. Armor that once stopped rifle bullets could not stop the shaped charge of a rocket. Even a light infantry unit hiding in the jungle could suddenly destroy a tank worth thousands of hours of industrial work. Japanese engineers did attempt improvements. Later versions of the Type 97 added slightly thicker armor and better guns. Some units experimented with improvised protective plates or sandbags attached to the hull. But none of these solutions truly stopped the bazooka. By late 1944, the weapon had spread across nearly every American infantry unit in the Pacific, and its impact went beyond just tank battles. The bazooka represented a shift in how wars were fought. For centuries, armor had usually required other heavy weapons to defeat it. Cannons destroyed armored knights. Anti-tank guns destroyed tanks. But the bazooka allowed a single infantryman to carry the power of an anti-tank weapon on his shoulder. It was portable, it was simple, and it was deadly. Japanese forces would continue using tanks until the end of the war, but their effectiveness declined as American anti-tank weapons improved. During the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945, Japanese tanks played only a limited role, often hidden as stationary defensive guns. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, Japanese armored units were rarely used for large attacks. Too many had been destroyed. Too many crews had learned that their armor was no longer protection against American rockets. Back on Saipan in 1944, the smoke from burning tanks drifted slowly over the battlefield as the sun rose. Marine patrols moved cautiously among the wrecks. Some tanks were still smoldering. Others had their turrets twisted from internal explosions. The metal hulls were scarred with blackened holes where bazooka rockets had penetrated. Inside those holes was the story of a new kind of warfare. The shaped charge had melted through steel like a cutting torch. For the Marines who fought that night, the bazooka became more than just a weapon. It was survival. It meant that even when enemy tanks appeared in the darkness, infantry were no longer helpless. They could fight back. They could win. And somewhere in the long history of armored warfare, the balance between tank and infantry had quietly shifted. The Japanese tankers who drove their Type 97s toward American lines that night believed their armor would carry them through the battle. They never expected that a soldier holding a metal tube on his shoulder could destroy them. But that is exactly what happened. In the jungles and volcanic islands of the Pacific, the bazooka proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are not the largest machines. Sometimes they are the ones carried by the soldiers waiting quietly in the dark.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.